So this is the third and final session of the day, and we kick off with a panel discussion. My name is Catherine Whitfield. I'm the Assistant Director for Cancer Strategy and Development in the Department of Health and Human Services, and it's our area that has collaborated with Safer Care Victoria to pull together today's event, and it's great to see you all here. What I might now do is just briefly introduce some of the panels, because some you obviously have met during their presentations, which were held earlier today. But we've got Senthil Ingarathnam, is that correct? Who is the head of pharmacy at Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre. And who else have we got that's new? That's all. Excellent. So we have, through the earlier part of the day through Slido, had some questions that have been put forward to put to the panel. And what I'd like you to do, if there are any questions that are on Slido that you would really like to have the panel address, please enter them in. Or if there's one there that you really would like to know the answer to, if you could actually like it. And the more people who like it, the quicker it will be elevated up in the priority listing. But first of all, I might like to just throw it open to the panel before we go to the questions, for the panel to think about what you see as the top 3 things that need to happen at a system level for us to address quality and safety in chemotherapy. And/or what are the top 3 things that should happen at a local area level, at the health service level, or possibly even at a network of health services level? Does anybody want to make a comment on those? There's a microphone on the table there, and I believe you need to speak right into it.
Been given instructions. I guess as in my talk today, I think the electronic prescribing and oncology system for right across the state that was the same system, I think that would be really fantastic if the department did that.
This is Victoria.
Victoria. Oh, yeah, national.
No, I mean in terms
Victoria.
of Victoria with our independent hospital boards. I might get Chrissy to talk about a statewide approach, but it is tricky in Victoria.
Yes, I know, I understand that. But yes, because for small rural, it was out of the question, it's too expensive.
Senthil?
So from my perspective, I think individual hospitals all manage their own risks and incidents that occur. And ultimately, I think taking that conversation to a state level is important, but we don't have the opportunity to share those incidents. I mean, we all report them through RISMAN, but we don't get that feedback. And ideally, it'll be useful to collate that data, feed it back to the institutions, share solutions that have been developed at an institutional level, and determine whether or not it's applicable to other sites.
Can I just ask, do you think there's a pre-existing mechanism to do that? Like, is there a group of pharmacists, or is there a group of cancer service providers that it would be a forum for sharing?
As far as I understand, RISMAN's a state-based tool. So ideally, the collation of the data should come from the state. And if we then had a multidisciplinary team that's set up with pharmacists, nurses, medical oncologists and haematologists to evaluate some of the risks and the solutions and then provide alerts back out to institutions, that would be quite helpful. That doesn't exist at the moment, but we could certainly look at doing that, I think.
Okay. Sally?
So I have 2, not 3. One would go further in that, looking at risk and data collection. And I think it's not just chemotherapy unit or chemotherapy, like physically what happens in the chemotherapy day unit, but I think it extends to adverse outcomes and deaths related to chemotherapy, which I think institutionally we may or may not collect data on, but there's very little way to benchmark any service against another, or to ensure that we're looking into it all appropriately and changing as required. And secondly, patient-reported outcomes. I think we can do much better, and this is a buzzword internationally, and I don't think we're doing it very well in Victoria. There are apps and other things that have been developed internationally which allow patients to report adverse effects, events or symptoms, which lead them on to suggested management plans and can be tailored to institutions to go through, who to contact at your institution. And I think this will get symptoms managed earlier, recognised earlier, managed earlier, and prevent serious adverse events and improve quality of life.
Great. Now, did you want me to talk local or state, national?
Whichever you prefer.
Okay.
Which do you think will have the biggest impact?
Nationally, some sort of accreditation for not just hospitals but individuals. In the medical profession have got that fairly well covered, but pharmacy and nursing don't necessarily have that under wraps, and particularly for pharmacy, whilst we use the term cancer pharmacist, oncology pharmacist, we don't actually have any specialist qualification we can assign to people and say, now you've got that qualification, you can practice. And I think that would, if people were going through a process of education, training and specialisation, they would then be able to use that qualification in communities and as well as hospitals and help manage some of the safety aspects we see with the services. In terms of statewide versus health services, we had a great statewide approach in Queensland until the government changed, and I think that's always the way. We had statewide medication services which oversaw medication safety for the whole of Queensland. We had a statewide approach to protocols, to cancer services management, and the government changed, and a lot of those services were just dissolved, and all the hospitals went back to being individual health services. So the statewide approach that I'm used to worked very well, but we need to be aware that how quickly things can change when politics change, and have something that works whatever environment we're in.
Probably the only thing I would like to add is around just greater collaboration amongst healthcare on a statewide level. Like we're faced with similar challenges, we're working on similar projects, and it'd be really great if we had some, I guess, just stronger collaboration around us not having to necessarily invest in the same projects or the same issues within our own organisation, that we could be addressing together for better efficiency, and then look at potentially standardising some practices and processes rather than having them so individualised to each organisation.
Now, I should say that if anybody doesn't want to use Slido and they do want to step up to one of the microphones, you could feel free. I might now, if there's nothing else on that, go to the questions from the Slido. So the first one, and I know it's not the most popular, but we'll come to those that are the most popular. The first one is, what is the impact of different pharmacy models of care and the implications for quality and safety? For example, challenges for community generalist pharmacists. So we've got a couple of pharmacists, so we might throw it to them first. So Senthil and then Chrissy.
Yeah, so I think, what Chrissy talked about before is pertinent, ensuring that there's that same level of training and competency assessment across the board, which is harder to do in a community setting where you don't necessarily have exposure to the same type of disease states that typically a hospital pharmacist would be. And also the availability of results, so whether or not it's pathology results or medical progress notes, which help tell the story about how your patient's going. So it's tricky from a community pharmacy sort of setting. We've increasingly started to work with our community pharmacists, and there are a number of pilot projects that are going on, essentially around monitoring symptoms. Immunotherapy patients, for instance, who develop colitis are usually started on high-dose steroids, but high-dose steroids bring a range of adverse events or side effects, and so we need to monitor those patients, and that can be done in a community pharmacy setting. It doesn't need to be done in the primary hospital that they're being treated at, or even through the GPs. So I think it's that conversation that needs to continue. And ultimately, if you've got the larger hospitals that are able to then provide training to some of the community pharmacy centres, then that can only be a better model that will allow greater access to drugs, but also safer care.
The aspect of community pharmacists getting involved in the cancer patient's care is a reality, that we can't just keep that care in hospitals, but patients should be entitled to get the same level of care wherever they go. The community pharmacist's role is often in supporting the patient through side effects or providing oral therapies. We have started educating community pharmacists, and I've got great examples of where community pharmacists have worked with us and where they've not necessarily worked against us, but done things that could be detrimental to patient care. So there's a lot of education to be had. But often it starts with the portability of the script and the patient. So if a patient's issued a script that is valid in any pharmacy, then they can take it to any pharmacy. And if we start looking back to where we actually, what we do with those scripts, if we start making it more legislative that we have a special prescription for chemo and other oral therapies, then only pharmacists that are trained to manage those scripts would be able to. And that might then help community pharmacists think a bit more about what they need to know.
Can I just go back to something, Sally, that you said about using apps and things to look for adverse events? Because we've just been touching on adverse events and who then might manage it. So how do you think that works across the team in terms of who receives that, who's responsible for the response?
So I think I'm not an expert in this, but I think there are models that have been trialled elsewhere, internationally, and that's the first thing, is to look for a model which is good and then adapt it to our, own state. But I can't see why it shouldn't be a national or state-based. I think we can do things better together with an overarching input with... sorry, I am a bit jet lagged, but the overarching, governance that has clear, so patients should be able to report, I'm having 3 episodes of diarrhoea, or I've had 1 loose bowel action, and they can get advice directly back about what to do or when to escalate and how to escalate, and then it can be individually tailored to institutions or, regional areas or something when it needs to be escalated or actioned further. Plus, I think you can get a feedback to the oncologist at their appointment, which has, a summary of what they've reported over the last 3 weeks, and same at their chemotherapy day unit. So they're touching base, twice every 3 weeks. So someone will be going through and checking that minor things haven't been lost through advice. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And did that answer the question?
I think sort of. Because there's still, if there's a community pharmacist involved,
Yes.
How do they get advised about, if they're actually providing some care?
So, I think this all comes back to communication as well, the same way that the CERT clinic lets GPs know that someone started chemo, and you'd say that should be standard and everyone should know, but I can tell you that it was only happening in about 20% of cases across 3 institutions that we audited prior to chemotherapy commencement. I think community pharmacists, probably we need to communicate better with our community pharmacists, because I think where I work, a lot of discharge, anything that can be given orally is done through community pharmacists because of capacity, and
of course
better communication.
There is the emerging program of super care pharmacies, or super pharmacies, or whatever they're called, where they're providing some first point of call in some settings.
I just want to make a comment that I think it's important to reward, high quality care in the community pharmacy sector, and that's not always homogenous. So, I guess looking at models where we're able to engage with particular pharmacies that show that they've, taken on training and competency assessment and work well with a single institution is something to work towards. But I think I'm just worried about necessarily broadening it out to all community pharmacy without ensuring that the necessary knowledge base is there.
To ensure quality, yep. I might move to the one that's top of the list. What is the ideal nurse-patient ratio in chemo day units? So this brings in our nursing panellists.
It's the $1 million question. So nursing ratios in our day unit do vary depending on what pod you're working in, but for chemotherapy purposes, nurses work on a 1 to 3 ratio. Rooms are set up with 6 chairs, so there's 2 nurses working in a chair. We did also, while we don't have a mandated number of patients that nurses would see, we did do some benchmarking, as I said previously, and I think 6 to 7 patients a day seems to be more than enough for one nurse to care for. I guess taking into account the complexities around the different treatment regimes, they're working across different tumour streams, patients can present unwell, it's not necessarily a straightforward treatment. So we obviously, as I said, 1 to 3 ratio, and I don't like to see the nurses looking after any more than definitely 7, but we really try and stick to 6. Yeah.
I'd support that, absolutely.
And there's another follow-up one which relates to nursing. And should all nurses have cytotoxic safety training, given that a patient, particularly in the context of multiple comorbidities, might be admitted to any part of the hospital? Any thoughts on that?
I guess we're an oncology hospital, so it's fairly standard at Peter MacCallum that all of our nurses do have that training. So even if you're not administering chemotherapy, they've all got training in managing of spills and waste and cytotoxic precautions.
And in our little hospital, they all do the handling the waste management, the ad hoc module. Yeah, they do that.
And of course, some chemotherapies are actually used in other settings, so rheumatology, etc. So how do we actually bring in to our whatever quality and safety mechanisms or systems that we create, how do we make sure that other areas that use cytotoxics are actually captured? Any thoughts?
Well, if it's outside of oncology, you're not going to really know, the oncology team aren't going to know about it. So the key person in that is the pharmacists, that they're the ones who would be dispensing, so they're the ones who probably can flag when there's a cytotoxic being administered outside of an oncology unit. But a lot of oncology units do the whole, more than oncology, it's infusion services.
Yeah. Anybody else have a comment on that one?
That's relevant for us.
I was just going to say, though, while cytotoxic handling is relevant in that setting, in cancer, we've got enough to do without taking on rheumatology, immunology, and we need to be very mindful about the work they need to do to manage their therapies.
I might just mention QE2 to you.
Yes, and that was not for a cancer indication, yes.
So that's just a reference to, there was an incident at QE2, which is in Brisbane, where some chemotherapy was being
drawn up
and done done with it on a ward that was not under the purview of pharmacy, or and it led to a sort of root cause analysis, which hopefully people learnt from.
I think, and perhaps the others would agree, that training and managing patients that have had cytotoxics should almost be a basic requirement if you're working in the healthcare service.
The problem with that is I don't see it enough. So I think that any person who's receiving cytotoxics needs to come under the umbrella of the oncology service, so that you've got that training there. I think you can't expect people to understand all the complications of, cyclophosphamide with a rheumatoid patient. They're just not going to know it if they don't see it often enough. And I think we need to make sure that's my thing about day oncology, that you actually have to have regular maintaining your skills and exposure to having the experience. And if you're doing it on an ad hoc basis, you just can't, you're not able to do it.
So obviously it depends on the frequency. I'm talking about in our hospital, they treat, several patients a week in other areas, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. The next couple of questions, and if we add up their votes, it's sort of very popular, is about e-prescribing. What I might do is ask Christine to talk about the experience in Queensland where we did implement a statewide version of CHARM. Now, I think I could preface my comments by saying that in Queensland at the time, we actually had a single unit record number, a linked file for every patient as sort of an underpinning, and very good IT infrastructure because of the way Queensland is set up.
Those were the days. So yeah, when we implemented CHARM, we did so as a statewide program in a number of centres, which worked very well. And interestingly, now we have in Queensland, we have CHARM, and each hospital now has its own set of protocols. We have Cerner as the IMR record. We have the MAR for prescribing all medication in the hospital apart from chemotherapy for cancer patients. We have iPharmacy for pharmacy to dispense. We have OzLab to look up patients' results, plus you can use IMR. We're actually now working with so many systems that everyone has a double screen, and sometimes you're just going backwards and forwards, and I think everyone's got that problem.
And so I guess then the question is, how do you have governance so that you don't end up with such... Because the way it started was that everybody had the Evercue protocols.
Yeah.
And they were all the same. So that, there were some efficiencies to be gained and some sense of confidence that people were using the standard protocols and not going off and modifying them. But without that governance, obviously the things have drifted. And so the efficiencies of being able to just change one lot of systems gets lost. And there's obviously, if you're running multiple screens and systems, there introduces a chance of error.
That's right.
And one of the other things I remember was a great boon or a suggested benefit of having e-prescribing in CHARM, where it linked to batch manufacturing, was the reduction in wastage. Do you think some of those, that was realised?
So how we use CHARM, and I think other hospitals use it, is that once you schedule, and other programs may be the same, once you schedule the patient on a protocol, they're scheduled for all their treatments, so we forward plan chemotherapy, and as such you can use CHARM like you would other programs to see who else, if you're not using it, who else may be due a dose. So that's really how we've used CHARM, and I think from what was presented this morning about day unit, that's how CHARM may be used as well.
Probably need Michelle Hong here, who's the system administrator, Peter Mack for CHARM. But our difficulty is that we can't claim from the PBS using CHARM. It's got to be another dispensing system. So again, that's introducing another opportunity for duplicate entry. So we don't use CHARM for its manufacturing capabilities. We certainly use its reference material so that there's a standardised worksheet which is produced for every drug that's required in a protocol. But we don't do anything else beyond that simply because it doesn't interface with Medicare. And until such time we've got a comprehensive end-to-end system that allows us to interface with everything else outside of the institution, it'll be difficult to do that.
So we use CHARM differently, obviously, as well. We use the manufacturing module.
And you have the same problem around Medicare?
Yes, we have to use iPharmacy to claim PBS.
So, I mean, although I, as somebody who's sort of gone through that process, have a lot of sympathy, and I'm here representing government, e-prescribing systems aren't always the be-all and end-all in terms of solving problems. I do understand the safety issues around e-prescribing, but it is interesting, Chrissy, that when you were talking about the COSA guidelines, that you said that there wasn't a single position that was able to really be reached on that. Is that right?
Perhaps I didn't make it clear. Our position is that computer-generated scripts and chemotherapy orders should be used, but it's hard to make something say must if we know that half of the hospitals in Australia can't comply, and there's no program that meets everyone's requirements, and that's probably where really our problem is, that no one's developed an IT platform that will meet everyone's requirements in cancer.
Yeah. Okay, so we've only got a few more minutes. There are some questions up here, and it may be that some of these, post the session, we may get short answers prepared, and we can post those, to you or through our website or something like that, because I think some are quite specific. Chrissy might want to take one on board about monoclonals.
Maybe I feel I just hold the mic, so...
I think that someone's actually looked into that, and some guidelines have been developed around, which was... So I don't have much more to add to the guidelines, which thought they were safe.
If you Google it,
Yeah.
you'll find that there was work done in Victoria about the safety of monoclonal antibodies.
So again, if we can find a website or something that references that or a copy of the document, we'll make sure that that gets posted at some point so it's available to people.
So it was about
And
2
I
years
have
ago,
one-
and it was safe. Yeah.
Yeah. One question from the floor. Good on your mind.
I knew the bright shirt would come in useful for something. I'm just struck by the fact that the voice that's absent in the room is the patient's voice. And I'm just wondering from a quality and safety perspective, we heard from Graham very eloquently this morning about his experience, but to what extent can we harness the power and influence of patients to be asking the right questions of providers when they come into hospital? So I just wanted to...
Who would like to take that?
Sorry, the actual question is...
So the question was around how do we support patients and educate them so that they can come to hospital and ask the right sorts of questions so that they get their needs met. Is that right? Paraphrase? About quality, okay.
Could not agree with you more, really. And I don't know how well we do it now. And we know that it takes time. And I think it takes, education about what to look for and who to contact and how to contact. And it needs to be, repeated, because we all know, when you tell someone they've got cancer, all they hear is you've got cancer. When you tell someone they're starting chemo, all they hear is you're starting chemo, and you write everything else and put it in your notes. No one's heard anything else. And I think it takes repetition and, having a good team, plus access points and points in writing, for them to go home and, reread. And I think one of the challenges, at least where I work, is English as a second language. Poorly translated documents, health literacy, and there's huge challenges. I think we don't need to reinvent a wheel though, and I think there is some, we can adapt wheels, but we don't need to start from scratch and reinvent. And I think the more that we allow people to report things, and the easier it is to report things, the better we're going to get at acknowledging and then treating issues early. And this is where I come back to apps or other screening programs that can help, but not a be-all and end-all, but can add to what we do. But the more access you have, the more questions you'll answer. This is where care coordinators, a CERT clinic, all these things can add to improve quality of life and patient care, and I think safety of chemotherapy delivery.
Robin?
May, can I just suggest I think when people start chemo, they don't know what their questions are, but I think the best group of people to ask about what we need to tell them is when they've got to the other end, and then they can look back and say, these are things that I really needed to know, but I didn't know to ask. And I think that's where their really rich information would provide us with that information of what to prevent and how to pose the quality questions, because I think when you're starting, it's too new. You're not going to know what to ask about. Yes, we need to get their information. We need to get them, yeah.
We shouldn't also discount the patient's role in safety aspects of giving chemotherapy in terms of if they know what they're having, what to expect. I know that doesn't meet for everyone. If they know they're supposed to be having a drug twice a day, an infusion, what the drug's called, then they're a really good aspect for checking when they actually get that. And I think that was highlighted in the South Australia case that patients hadn't realised that they weren't getting something twice a day when they should have been getting it twice a day and they're only getting it once a day. And a lot of patients with that information, that can empower them to be the safety barrier or the safety check at the final step.
And does that emphasise then the role of patient education at the very beginning so that they're well informed about what to expect?
Patient information and them being able to take responsibility. And again, I know it's not suitable for everyone, but I think we often discount the patient's ability to actually have, because it's been given in daycare, because it's been given in the hospital, they're not always informed enough to be able to actually check what they're getting, and I think that's probably really important for our patients.
I think despite best efforts, you're always going to have patients that, fall through the cracks, and we probably see that more in oral therapies. So even though we've got really good safeguards in place for parenteral chemotherapy, those safeguards aren't necessarily there for oral chemotherapy. And, absolutely, we've got to risk assess patients based on their health literacy levels, target our education accordingly, and then ensure that, they've understood what we've tried to impart. And I think there are various models out there, but it's it's probably not adopted to the same level.
And I think orals is a topic of conversation for another day. I think we can talk about that for a while. But I'd like to ask you all to thank the panellists for their insights.